Since the 10-year anniversary of the end of the war in Iraq will be here 4 days from me writing this script, I thought it appropriate to go over one of the worst, most erroneous, deceitful, deceptive, and just axiomatically wrong videos prageru has made. And that's really saying something, because it's, prageru. The most unabashedly dishonest conservative fracking billionaire funded right-wing dumping ground that's been trying to indoctrinate children for years with motion graphics paid for by profits that have been made via pumping the atmosphere with methane, resulting in my state flooding and us cooking alive during any time other than December. Charles Koch's democracy-hating, world-burning, same gas as a fart is pumping into the air in the tons per day antics aside. We'll do another video on him soon. Let's get into something you're gonna need to strap a pillow onto your head for, and a drink to get through, because you'll be smashing your head against the most jagged surface you can find by the end of it.
Why did the United States go to war against Iraq in 2003?
For oil. Alan Greenspan, former chair of the Federal Reserve, expressly stated that he told the White House before the Iraq War that removing Saddam was essential to secure world oil supplies, according to a Reuters interview in 2007. Furthermore, the Polish foreign minister said, "We have never hidden our desire for Polish oil companies to finally have access to sources of commodities. Our remark, which came after he had signed a deal with Halliburton, and that access to Iraq's oil field was, quote, their ultimate objective." Unquote. On top of this, Chuck Hagel, the former Secretary of Defense, literally said, quote, "People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are," unquote. And to top only the tip of the iceberg off, the CENTCOM commander at the time said, quote, "First of all, I think it's really important to understand the dynamics that are going on in the Middle East. And of course it's about oil. It's very much about oil, and we can't really deny that." Unquote. So not only do you have multiple US and Polish officials admitting it was for oil, but let's get at the WMD argument. After the Gulf War, it destroyed its chemical weapons stockpile and halted its biological and nuclear weapons programs under the UN Security Council. This didn't stop Bush from asserting that Saddam was still using chemical weapons. Ironic that we target one country for having nuclear weapons when we have the second largest stockpile in the world. Or do we just use nukes in the name of freedom and democracy?
The decision was controversial at the time and remains so today, but the reason was clear. Saddam Hussein, the brutal dictator of Iraq for 35 years, was the central threat to peace in the Middle East.
Then why did Reagan give clandestine aid to both Iraq and Iran during their war with each other? The reason for funding both sides in the war was to create a militaristic equilibrium in which neither side completely dominated the oil region.
The Bush administration believed the establishment of a functioning democracy in Iraq would encourage the growth of democracy elsewhere in the Arab world. As democracy spread, terrorism would retreat.
I'm glad that you mentioned this is what they believed, because it's exactly the opposite of what happens in a pragmatic reality. ISIS was an express reaction to the US intervention in Iraq, a place where they never needed to be, because they were so distraught with hatred and fury towards Western influence that they formed a vigorously Sunni organization that made it their object to destroy the puppet government of Iraq. Where do you think the Iraqi officers went after the war? On leave to Dubai? No! They lost all of their benefits because their country was crumbling, with what was left of its infrastructure being taken by the new government. We've seen this time and time again with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Taliban, Boko Haram, all being express reactions to US intervention. In fact, the reason cited for both attacks on the World Trade Center was because the US was heavily involved in Israel. And it's ironic that you claim we did it to spread freedom and democracy when we actively aid and abet Saudi Arabia, one of the most totalitarian regimes in terms of civil liberties that has been known to fund terrorist groups. I'll have Marcus explain the Sunni-Shia Kurd conflict and let him take it away.
Iraq is a nation of three major ethnic groups: Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, and the Kurds. So this is a nation almost impossible to stabilize or even survive under true democracy. The Kurds want to have their own sovereign nation, Kurdistan, while the Shiites do not want to be dominated by the Sunni minority. Saddam was a Sunni and held these three groups together as a nation with an iron fist. So the Bush administration, you have two options in viewing this. They were either very short-sighted in thinking that a democratic Iraq would be stable and free from the sectarian violence brought on by Shiite Muslims seeking revenge for all the years under the oppressive Sunni minority, which was Saddam. Or your second option is This war was not at all about instilling democracy in Iraq.
But it is on the blood-stained life and career of Saddam Hussein that we need to concentrate in order better to understand why the United States felt forced to act in 2003. We begin with the Iran-Iraq War, which Saddam started in 1980 and which lasted until 1988. 1 million people died in the course of the decade-long struggle. And during that war, weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, especially poison gas, were used on a regular basis by both sides.
I'll point you to the historic event a shocking number of people hadn't heard of, called the Iran-Contra. During the 1980s, senior administration officials under the Reagan administration secretly facilitated the sale of arms to the Khomeini government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was the subject of an arms embargo. The administration hoped to use the proceeds of the arms sale to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Under the Boland Amendment, further funding of the Contras by the government had been prohibited by Congress. The official justification for the arms shipments was that they were part of an operation to free 7 American hostages being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, a paramilitary group with Iranian ties connected to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Some within the Reagan administration hoped the sales would influence Iran to get Hezbollah to release the hostages. However, the first arms sales authorized to Iran were in 1981, prior to the American hostages having been taken in Lebanon. And you have the temerity, the impudence, the impertinence to say that Saddam was the only bad guy. Reagan gave weapons to both of them!
Once his war with Iran ended, instead of building up his shattered nation, Saddam decided to embark on another lunatic adventure. In 1990, he tried to grab 19% of the world's oil supply by invading Kuwait.
Way to self-report the fact that the Gulf War was just as much about oil as the war in Iraq was. Isn't it ironic that you have multiple US and Polish officials expressly stating that we went to Iraq for oil, and you're here chastising Saddam for taking oil? But Saddam didn't go in with no reason. Rather, Saddam thought Kuwait was crossing their border and drilling Iraqi oil fields, which is obviously of vital importance to OPEC nations. Even then, what reason did we have to be there besides oil? Why does prageru insist on doing away with UN-backed coalitions?
His brief annexation of Kuwait proved to be another disaster. The mother of all battles, as Saddam called it, turned out to be a 3-week rout, his Iraqi army utterly defeated by a US-led coalition. But rather than trying Saddam as a war criminal, America and the West allowed him to stay in power.
Isn't it hilarious that the US coalition came from Saudi Arabia, the funding of which prageru never makes any mention of? I could say the exact same for Bush's atrocities committed in Iraq. Rather than trying him as a war criminal, they allowed him to stay in power.
This appeasement eventually led Saddam, once again, to draw entirely the wrong conclusion and to his making yet another colossal mistake. He arrogantly believed that his Iraqi army might actually defeat the United States in a second encounter. His trump card, he believed, or at least attempted to make the world believe, was his possession of WMD.
Another utter fabrication from a faux university whose credits don't transfer anywhere, since they're not an actual university. Yet another lie. As I've stated, along with the Iraqi government, the UN Special Security Council actively diffused and destroyed all chemical and biological weapons Saddam had in his stockpile.
Large quantities of poison gas and, if only in his imagination, a rapidly progressing nuclear weapons development program.
Who is the major power in that war? Who had the already built nuclear weapons? That's right. And what was the country they gave weapons to? That's right, the one that actually currently has a developing nuclear weapons program.
No reason to doubt that he had WMD, as he'd used poison gas in his war against Iran. No one, not the Germans, not the Russians, not the British, had any doubts about this.
As you've kept on reiterating time and time again, and as I've kept on debunking, after the Persian Gulf War, the United Nations with the government of Iraq located and destroyed large quantities of Iraqi chemical weapons and related equipment and materials. Iraq ceased its chemical, biological, and nuclear programs. And not only this, but the CIA couldn't prove that his regime was actually producing chemical and biological weapons, which cast doubt in the minds of so many Americans. But if you thought that was bad, 3 days before the invasion, they said that while Saddam likely did possess weapons of mass destruction, he was not likely to use them against anyone unless he felt threatened.
Looking back at the 12 years between the Gulf War and the Iraq War, Saddam might have been able to re-establish international credibility by complying with the 16 reasonable UN resolutions passed between November 1990 and December 1999. These resolutions simply required Saddam to, among other things, destroy all of his ballistic missiles with a range greater than 150 kilometers, stop support for terrorism internationally and prevent terrorist organizations from operating within Iraq, and bear financial liability for damage from the Gulf War. But Saddam spent the 1990s defying and mocking America and Britain in every possible way.
Interesting that you mock the UN here for not having enough power to keep Saddam at bay, when conservatives have historically voted against increasing allocation of funds to them and granting them more power where they need to intervene.
He attempted to shoot down Royal Air Force and US Air Force planes over the no-fly zones created to prevent him from mass slaughtering his own citizens.
Your intelligence and understanding of language really makes its revelation here, because he shot at the planes in the no-fly zone because it's a fucking no-fly zone! A no-fly zone means nobody can fly without repercussions.
He corruptly profited from the UN oil for food scandal, while Iraqi children starved to death.
Saddam was a bad guy, but corrupt autocrats and leaders who starve their people is more commonplace in the world than you think. So what gives us the mandate to specifically invade Iraq and not some other nation where this happens that doesn't have a commodity in high demand? Additionally, 12% of America lives below the poverty line, and prageru doesn't want to divert government funds to social welfare programs. Instead, they keep on making the bootstrappy arguments while people are too emaciated to exist comfortably. And now you care about people starving? Now you want to intervene when people are hungry? Really consistent of you.
$5,000 to the families of every Palestinian suicide bomber. He harbored many of the world's leading terrorists.
And conservatives still want to divert funds from public healthcare, infrastructure, parental leave, and give it to the defense budget, which goes to Saudi Arabia, funds terrorism, and lets the military-industrial complex take it out and make a killing via contract.
He expelled UN weapons inspectors.
6 years after they had completely disarmed Iraq. What would have been the point of them being there afterwards?
The terrorist attack on the United States of 9/11, something for which Saddam was not responsible for or ever blamed for. Any war against terror that did not involve toppling this brutal dictator, who might supply WMD to terrorists for future attacks, would have been absurd.
I feel like a broken record, reiterating the same points over and over again due to the fact that most every faux rationale this guy has for invading Iraq is the result of US interventionism in the first place. Talk about funding terrorism when we donate tons upon tons to Saudi Arabia, who directly fund terrorist organizations. Bush lied in saying Baghdad was still building weapons even though the UN had concluded otherwise. You're contradicting yourself in saying you want to prevent terrorist attacks when the entirety of prageru's existence is to be sycophantic towards Israel, when it's US involved in Israel that caused every terrorist attack on US soil. They'd lock me up in a loony bin for ingeminating myself so many times. Israel, Israel, Israel!
Still, had he backed down and accepted repeated United Nations resolutions, especially those requiring him to prove he had destroyed his stockpiles of WMD and had no nuclear weapons development program, there would have been no US action.
Let's spice it up a bit and change things, because if I say the UN concluded Baghdad had no capabilities pertaining to WMDs, the people around me are gonna look for an off switch on my body because I sound glitched because of the reiteration. We're the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons through offensive means during wartime, so why aren't there constant UN probes into what we're doing, especially now? Since we possess even more weapons of more mass destruction, is that a rationale for countries to invade us?
Instead, he only became more bellicose. That's why some leading Democrats, such as Senators Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden and John Kerry, voted to authorize the Second Iraq War. Only later did they recant their decisions after claiming that they'd been lied to by the administration.
They voted in favor of it because their warhawk establishment neoliberal corporate shills and severe needs of spine implementations, and they should have voted against it because they have access to highly classified intelligence. Bernie Sanders is an actual leftist, which is why he voted against it. Bush lied to the American people in order to profit and finish what his father started.
But there had been no need for the Bush administration to lie. Its assessment of the threat that Saddam posed concurred with that of the Clinton administration, as well as with numerous European intelligence services.
Where's your citation? Oh, that's right, you never cite shit!
And the road to a democratic Middle East had to begin in Iraq.
So democratic, it left it up to coalitions to fight Iraqi officer-led terrorist groups for over the next half-decade.
Vicious, mass-murdering despot who had convinced the world that he had WMD and would use them, stood in the way. In the spring of 2003, that was obvious both to Republicans and many Democrats, as well as to the leadership of Britain and dozens of other nations. That's why President Bush took America to war against Iraq. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University.
Kill me. So, as you've clearly seen here today, people will still defend what is emphatically the objectively wrong position when there's oil billionaire money paying them to rehash pro-interventionist talking points. No matter how deceptive and straight up wrong their rationales are for going to war, they still couldn't possibly care less about anyone other than themselves because no amount of scruples comes before profit for these people. Disincentivize US production of oil and move to green energy. There's gonna be less wars over that.